2. Turn to the Book of Deuteronomy, chapter 1. Book of Deuteronomy, chapter 1, we'll read verse 3. And it came to pass in the 40th year, in the 11th month, on the first day of the month, that Moses spake unto the children of Israel, according unto all that the Lord had given him in commandment unto them. The time that is mentioned in this verse is the 40th year, the 11th month, the first day of that month. It has reference to the time frame of Israel, children of Israel coming out of Israel, or Egypt. And it came to pass, and it happened. There's another way to read that. What happened? Well, that's introduced by the word that. After he gives us this time frame, and it came to pass that. This is what happened. Moses spake unto the children of Israel. What did he speak to them about? According unto all that the Lord had given him in commandment unto them. So he's speaking to them concerning the commandments of God. Now we all know that one generation has passed. A new generation of Israelites are on the scene. And they are about to enter Canaan. Before they do, Moses repeats the commandments or the laws of God. And this verse really serves as part of the introduction to the book of Deuteronomy. The word Deuteronomy simply means second law. What's indicated here is that the law of God is repeated in the book of Deuteronomy. The fact that it is repeated speaks of its importance. So the book of Deuteronomy is a reiteration of the law of God. In the book of Deuteronomy, God, through Moses, gives his redeemed a review course concerning the commandments or the laws of God. The book of Deuteronomy consists of what we could call a series of farewell messages from Moses, who now is 120 years old. And in these messages, he repeats the laws of God. In the book of Deuteronomy, the words "thou shalt" occur 230 times. Thou shalt. If you don't like those two words, thou shalt, probably better stay away from Deuteronomy. 230 times. Thou shalt not. Oh, people don't like that at all. 76 times. The word commandments occur 42 times. The words I command 36 times. To do 35 times. observe to do 14 times. I keep the commandments, or keep the commandments, 6 times. So the whole purpose of the book is to remind the redeemed of the Lord, you are under the government of God. Moses is reminding them of the government of God. So the book of Deuteronomy is a repetition or a restatement of the laws of God. They were so important that they were repeated. And they were repeated over and over and over again. We see in Deuteronomy 17 that the future kings of Israel, God knew that their government would change to kings. But in Deuteronomy 17, verse 18, he says, all your future kings are to have a copy of the law of God. Deuteronomy 17, verse 18, and it shall be, when he sitteth upon the throne of his kingdom, that he shall write him a copy of this law in a book, out of that which is before the priests, the Levites. And it's interesting to note that Jesus quoted from the book of Deuteronomy more than any other Old Testament book. The book of Deuteronomy is about the laws of God, the government of God. And Jesus quoted from it more than any other Old Testament book. The idea conveyed in Deuteronomy is that God expected obedience from His people. The book of Deuteronomy stresses the significance of the laws of God. In the Bible, there are over 2,000 laws stated. The 10 Commandments summarize them all. But in the Bible, there are over 2,000 laws stated. Now, we would put these in 3 classes. There's the ceremonial law of God. These, of course, pointed to Christ. They typified Christ, and they were fulfilled by Christ. There is civil law. These laws dictated Israel's daily living. They are the principles behind which are still to govern society. There are the principles. Then, of course, there's the moral law of God. God's moral standard for regulating human conduct. Laws based upon God's character and His design for His creation. And these laws are presented in one of 2 ways, these moral laws. Either from the positive, thou shalt, or from the negative, thou shalt not. It's just 2 ways of presenting the same truth. God's laws are rules of conduct. They are His appointments. They are His determinations. They are His sanctions. They are His orders. They are His boundaries. And we thank God for such. We thank God that He has established some boundaries. He has given us some laws. The subject of the message is the teaching and the principles of God's laws. Now, our society, our culture, and really the whole world, for a long time, has been in the process of secularization. Secularization. What is that? Well, it's the process of separating from the Lord and His Word. This doesn't happen overnight. This has been going on for a long time. It's the process of removing the influence of God and His Word. It is the process of removing biblical faith and morals, biblical morals. Because immoral people sometimes talk about morals, but I'm talking about biblical morals. So it's the process of removing biblical morals and values from the public arena. These have no place in the public arena. That's the process of secularization. The process of moving toward acceptance, tolerance, non-judgmentalism of what is condemned by God. The process of secularization. This process accelerates as we draw closer to the coming of Christ. And we've seen the acceleration of the process. And today, to further accelerate this process, there is the rampant peddling. It's been going on for years, but it's been accelerated. The rampant peddling of humanism, which is basically the religion of self. Pluralism, which is the idea or the thought process that one idea or thought is just as valid as another. I believe creation, you believe evolution. One's just as valid as the other. There's relativism. Truth and morality are determined in relation to culture and society or circumstances. All of these things are peddled, are being sold. And all of these have their basis in the philosophy that there is no absolute truth. But the laws of God say different. There is no absolute truth. Who's to say what's right? Who's to say what's wrong? Well, God's laws say there is absolute truth. Our society, our culture, and really the whole world is engulfed in moral relativism, which again says there is not only no absolute truth, but there's no authority to determine truth. Who gives you the right to determine truth? Well, you see, that's based upon a false philosophy. Truth's already been determined by God. It's not left to us. Moral relativism basically is saying there is no standard. That is, there is no one or no thing against whom we can be measured or against whom conduct can be measured. There is no one who has dropped the plumb line and established the authority to which we must all answer. So there not only is no absolute truth, there is no authority to say what is true, what is not true. The result of this, of course, is that every individual becomes his or her own personal authority. But the laws of God say different. God is the authority. Ours is a society and culture, and again the whole world, caught up in personal freedom. That is, there are no guidelines except those which you choose to adopt for your own life. And you can't force your guidelines on someone else who gives you the authority. And again, God's laws say different. Man says there are only self-imposed guidelines. God says differently. That's why you have to remove God. Because God says that everything man says, God says, no, that's not the way it is. So man's idea, we got to get rid of this God. And it's the process of secularization. We've been seeing it all our life. We have, for the most part, not every individual, and by most part, I mean I'm not including every individual. But we, for the most part, have become an amoral society. Amoral. Which is really worse than immoral. It's a result of immoral. Amoral is an awareness, an unawareness of, or an indifference or apathy concerning questions of right or wrong. It's the attitude, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. That's an amoral society. It's the result of a prolonged and persistent immorality. Immorality eventually leads to amorality. And amorality just causes a further descent into the abyss of immorality. You can see this. I mean, if anybody has any awareness of human nature, human depravity, any awareness of the principles of God's Word, you can see when this happens, this is going to happen next. Oh, that'll never happen. Oh, yes, it will. Oh, yes, it will. And then when this happens, and this happens. It's a process. Amorality is an advanced stage of immorality. And in amoral society and culture, biblical absolutes are done away with. And people do that which is right in their own eyes. And they establish their own standards. Last verse of the book of Judges, Judges 21:25. An amoral society is described. In those days, there was no king. There was no authority. There was no king in Israel, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. And to such a society, the proclamation that not only is there a God, but He has laws. And He has authority. To such a society, that truth is very offensive. It's very much hated. Why? Because the entire system of God's laws declare loud and clear, there is truth. And if there is truth, there is error. God's laws declare loud and clear, there is authority. And God is the authority. God's laws declare there are rules. There are rules. And if there are laws and there are rules and there is authority, then there is a judge. One who determines when you have crossed the line. There is personal accountability. Oh, these are truths that man cannot handle. They come unglued. But it's what God's laws declare. Oh, how thankful we ought to be for God's laws that help us to discern. And that's an ability that's been lost. The ability of discernment. God's laws help us to discern in this tangled jungle of this world. So that's what we want to consider today, the laws of God. First of all, let's consider the importance of God's laws. This is seen from the fact that the people were to know the laws of God. It's still so today. Laws in our state, laws in any other state. Ignorance is no excuse. It's your responsibility to know the law. And God's people were to know the law. In Exodus 18, Moses speaking to his father-in-law Jethro, and he says to him in verse 16, when they, referring to the people, have a matter, they come unto me. And I judge between one and another. In other words, I make discernment. And I do make them know the statutes of God and His laws. When they come to me with their questions, when they come to me with their situations, I tell them God's laws, God's commandments. They need to know. Moses saw the importance of the people knowing the laws of God. Well, Jethro proceeds to tell Moses, and he was right. Moses, you're taking too much upon yourself. There should be others that the people can come to with their matters. And Moses, this would allow you to be more free. To do what? Verse 20, and thou shalt teach them ordinances and laws, and shalt show them the way wherein they must walk, and the work they must do. Jethro also saw the importance of the people knowing this is what God says. This is what God says. Bring all your matters, whatever they might be, but this is what God says. People need to know. The importance is seen from the instruction concerning the laws of God. Notice in Deuteronomy 6, familiar verses. And these words, verse 6, which I command thee this day, shall be in thy heart. The laws of God are so important, they need to be in your heart. And thou shalt teach them diligently unto thy children. They're so important, you need to teach them to your children. And talk of them. They need to be the subject of your conversation. When thou sittest in thine house, when thou walkest by the way, when thou liest down, and when thou risest up. Notice, sittest, walkest, liest, risest. It covers everything. It covers the day. He says you're to talk of the laws of God. Why? Because you need to know. Because they're important. Thou shalt bind them for a sign upon thine hand. Keep them visible so that you don't forget. And they shall be as frontlets between thine eyes. And thou shalt write them upon the posts of thy house and on thy gates. All of this speaks of the importance of the law of God. The importance is seen from the fact that the laws of God were to be publicly read. Today, we need to keep God out of the public arena. God has no place in the public arena, is what is being peddled today. God's laws say differently. Deuteronomy 31. Deuteronomy 31. They were to be publicly read. Over 2,000 of them in the Word of God. And they were to be publicly read. Verse 10, Moses commanded them, saying, at the end of every 7 years, in the solemnity of the year of release and the Feast of Tabernacles, when all Israel is come to appear before the Lord thy God in the place which he shall choose, thou shalt read this law before all Israel in their hearing. Gather the people together, men, women, and children, and the stranger that is within thy gates, that they may hear, that they may learn and fear the Lord your God, and observe to do all the words of this law, and that their children, future generations, that have not known anything, may hear and learn to fear the Lord your God as long as ye live in the land whither ye go over Jordan to possess it. The importance of the law is seen from the fact that it was to be remembered. Malachi 4 and verse 4 says, remember ye the law of Moses. Remember! Don't forget. The law of Moses, my servant, which I commanded unto him in Horeb, for all Israel, with the statutes and judgments. Remember what God has said. Remember! In this day when people are peddling and pushing, you have to have God out of the public arena. God has no place in the public arena. Remember what God has said. Don't forget. Don't forget the laws of God. God has given us laws so that we can have a morally sane society, which we no longer have. And the laws of God need to be known. They need to be established in our hearts. They need to be taught. They need to be spoken of in the circumstances of life. They need to be made visible and remembered. All of this speaks of the importance of God's laws. Let's consider the proclamation of the laws of God. By that I mean, what do the laws of God proclaim? Every law that God gave, every commandment, every prohibition that He issued, whether it was moral, civil, ceremonial, it was a proclamation, an affirmation of truth. The fact is, the laws of God proclaim truths that men hate. and do not want to be reminded of. God's laws proclaim truths about God. God is the giver of the law. In the giving of the Ten Commandments, just prior to giving the Ten Commandments, Exodus 20 verse 2, He said, I am the Lord. A declaration of His person. I am the Lord. And that is followed by, Thou shalt. I am the Lord. Thou shalt. To enforce the law, God says, I'm the Lord. I am the Lord. He is saying, I was, I am, and I'll always be what I was and am. Therefore, thou shalt. Thou shalt. I am the Lord. A name that reveals that He is the one and true God. Well, that's your opinion. No, God said it. I am the Lord. Well, I don't believe that. Well, that's your problem. That doesn't make it not so. I am the Lord. It is a name that reveals the reality of God. People don't want to hear about the reality of God. But God declares it over and over. I am the Lord. It declares the certainty of His being. A name that reveals the constancy and perpetuity of His nature and will. A name that reveals the infinite excellency and perfection of His nature. A name that reveals that He is the Creator and gave man his being. I am the Lord. A name that reveals He is Supreme Governor and Lawgiver. A name that reveals His sovereignty. I am the Lord. Therefore, based upon who I am, thou shalt have no other gods before me. That's the foundational commandment. I am the Lord. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. I am the Lord. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. I am the Lord. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Why? Because I'm the Lord. I am the Lord. Honor thy father and thy mother. I am the Lord. Thou shalt not kill. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. Thou shalt not covet. Why? Because I'm the Lord. I'm the authority. The laws of God proclaim God's authority. The laws of God are a proclamation of His authority and His government. Every law, every commandment, every prohibition that God issued, again, whether moral, civil, or ceremonial, doesn't matter. They all declare the absolute authority of God. His authority speaks of His person, speaks of who He is, speaks of His dominance, speaks of His rule, speaks of His right to command whatever He pleases, speaks of His absolute claim upon His people. You see, every law, every commandment, every prohibition that God issued was a declaration of God's rule, a declaration of God's sway, a declaration of the government of God. The laws of God are a proclamation of His standards. God has standards. A standard is something established by authority. It's a rule of measurement, a rule by which we can measure conduct, behavior. God is precise. God is definite and particular. This is seen in creation. God has established laws governing His creation, commonly referred to today as Mother Nature. There is no such thing as Mother Nature. There are the laws of nature. And guess who put them there? God created the universe with rules. They still operate. The universe, you better thank God. They still operate by God's rules and laws. Notice in Psalm 104, verses 5 through 9. Who laid the foundation of the earth, that it shall not be removed forever. The world's going to last as long as God wants it to. Thou coverest it with the deep as with a garment. The waters stood above the mountains. Why? Because God has rules. God has laws. At thy rebuke they fled. Because God's in authority. They fled at the voice of thy thunder. They hasted away. They go up by the mountains. They go down by the valleys into the place which thou hast founded for them. Thou hast set a bound that they may not pass over, that they turn not again to cover the earth. He sendeth the springs into the valleys which run among the hills. And on we could go. Why do we know that a few hours from now, night will come? Because of God's laws. Day will come because of God's laws. Night will come. How do I know that when it's raining, it will stop? Well, because the weatherman said it would at 3 o'clock. No, that's not the reason. Because God has laws. I know today that when it rains, it's going to stop. Need to ask somebody who's against the laws of God when it's raining. You're standing out in the middle of the rain and ask them, do you think it's going to stop? Oh, I don't know. They know it's going to stop. And how do you know that? Because God's laws. God's laws. God's ruling. The course of nature. And when it comes, God has a standard for His creation. And when it comes to mankind, God has set a standard. And it's revealed. And it's declared in His laws. You read the laws, specifically the book of Leviticus, concerning the offerings. You read the specifics of the laws of God. And what it all declared is this: it matters to God how things are done. Well, why this much salt? Because it matters to God how things are done. Well, it doesn't matter. Oh, yes, it does. It may not matter to you. It may not matter to me. But it matters to God how things are done. and God's laws proclaim that truth loud and clear. God's laws proclaim truths about man. Every law, every command, every prohibition was a reminder. Man is depraved. Man is sick. Man is twisted. Man has sinful inclinations. Man has a proneness to wander. The very fact that he has to be told, you do not murder, that says something about man. You do not steal. You do not commit adultery. You do not lie with a man as with a woman. You do not lie with your mother. Man has to be told these things because man is sick. He's twisted. The problem with society today is they think they've gotten beyond the twisted nature of man, and their nature just is twisted as it's ever been. Why does a man have to be told that incest is wrong? He's sick. Why does he have to be told that bestiality is wrong? Because he's sick. And by the way, that's what's coming next. Oh, you're ridiculous. Mark it down. Mark it down. I said 30 years ago, homosexuality, transgender is coming next. You really think? Mark it down. One thing leads to another. Oh, you're being ridiculous. Read your Bible. Why does man have to be told not to commit idolatry? Why does man have to be told not to blaspheme the name of the one who holds his very breath in his hand? Because man is sick. He's twisted. The laws of God reveal the horrible wickedness and depravity of man. Man doesn't want to be reminded of how sick he is. Every law, every command, every prohibition is a reminder that man is a needy creature. Man needed boundaries. He still does. He still does. Children need boundaries. Men, adults need boundaries. That's what laws are, they're boundaries. Man needs some confines for his own protection, for his own well-being. And that's what the laws of God do. Every law, every command, every prohibition is a reminder that man left to himself will ruin himself. And will ruin the world that he lives in. And will ruin the society that he's a part of. Left to himself. Oh, we want to be our own law. And you'll destroy everything. And already has. And we see this playing out right before our eyes. God gradually removing His restraining hand in preparation for the reign of the Antichrist. The laws of God are meant to protect man from himself. From all this, we see that these laws are a manifestation of the mercy and the grace and loving kindness and the goodness of God. The consequences of breaking God's laws proclaim the seriousness of such. This is clearly seen in the severe punishments that were to be carried out for disobedience to his laws. I believe principle is being taught here. People were stoned to death for blasphemy. Why? To show how serious it is. Oh, so you're saying people ought to be stoned for blasphemy? That's not what it said. Those were civil laws governing Israel. But there's principles. Those principles still stand today. Blasphemy is a sin worthy of death. Shows the seriousness. They were stoned for Sabbath breaking. Well, you think God's churches are almost empty now? Start stoning people for Sabbath breaking. They'll be empty. People were stoned for following false religions, for idolatry, for adultery, for fornication, for disrespect of parents. I believe all of this just to show the seriousness and the gravity of the laws of God. The variety of God's laws proclaim that they are all-encompassing. There were laws regarding every aspect of worship. There were laws regarding every aspect of family life. Marriage, divorce, parenting, children, relationships between husbands and wives, etc. Why were there laws for all these things? Because it matters to God. There were laws regarding labor, employers and employees, because it matters to God. There's a right way and there's a wrong way. There were laws regarding money. It's my money, I can do with what I want. No, you can't. Well, you can, but you shouldn't. There were laws regarding property. If you had an oxen that was uncontrolled, there were laws concerning that. There were laws concerning property and put in trust. There were laws concerning inheritance. There were laws concerning landmarks. There were even laws concerning fruit-bearing trees. Why? Because I don't care what area of life you're talking about, it matters to God. There were laws regarding the building of houses. Deuteronomy 22:8. You were to put a railing along the roof. Why? So no one would fall off. There were laws regarding gardening. Deuteronomy 22:9. All of these, the principle here is it matters to God. There were laws regarding farming. Deuteronomy 22:10. Laws regarding clothing. Couldn't even wear cotton and wool together. Well, what's it matter? It matters to God. Must have made a law about it. There's teaching here. There were laws regarding restitution. There were laws regarding business. No interest on loans to God's people. No bribes, no oppression. There were laws regarding animals. There were laws regarding neighbors. There were laws regarding health. There were dietary laws. There were laws regarding war. There were laws regarding justice, regarding clean and unclean, Leviticus chapter 11. From all of that, we see that God's laws covered and reached into every aspect of life. What this means is that we are called to live out every aspect of our lives in obedience to the revealed will of God. Over 2,000 laws in the Old Testament, and with such, they were being reminded of God. People need to be reminded of God. I don't care how mad they get. I don't care how hateful they get. People need to be reminded that there is a God. And He has rules. He has laws. They were being reminded of God's government in every aspect of their life. They were being reminded of God's claims upon them in every aspect and every realm of their life. They were being reminded that God has set boundaries for every aspect and realm of life. They were being reminded that God has standards for every aspect and realm of life. They were being reminded of God's jurisdiction. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. They were being reminded of their own responsibility and their own accountability. With the proclamation of God's laws, they were being taught to be mindful of God in all things and to acknowledge God and His ways in all things. The great variety of God's laws reveal that God has something to say about everything. And He has the right to say it. And He's already said it. He's already said it. So again, by way of introduction to the commandments, the Ten Commandments, we hear God say, I am the Lord. I am the Lord. Thou shalt not have any other gods before me. I am the one. And I have laws. And I have rules. Life is to be all about me. That's God. Not me, but God. Oh, how thankful we ought to be for the laws. For the laws of God. And that's why I've said so many times, people today who we put in charge to solve the world's problems, they don't even know what the problem is. They don't even know what the problem is. How did we get here? We have issues today that human history has not had issues with. Why are these issues today? How did we get here? Go back. You broke this law, you broke this law, you broke this law. And here we are. Need to get back to obeying God. Obeying God. The problem is a disobedience to God. That's never proclaimed to be the problem today. But that is the problem. Oh, for a politician to stand up and say what we need is Jesus Christ. What we need to do is ask for forgiveness for all these laws and mention them that we have broken for decade after decade after decade for hundreds of years. He wouldn't have a chance of getting elected. Therefore, he's not going to say those things. That's what we need. And I would say that most of God's people would be offended if a politician talked that way. That is sad. Because most of God's people have bought into, I believe God, but we got to keep God out of the schools. We got to keep. You've been duped. You've been duped. You're part of the problem. We all are. In reality. Thank God for his laws. Brother Ben, if you come and lead us in verse song, let's all stand.